should have died in those mountains. Any rational analysis of what happened during that October night in 1983 leads to the same conclusion. 2 young soldiers, alone in the wilderness, face to face with something that could have torn them apart without effort. Instead, I'm sitting in my suburban home 40 years later, writing words I was ordered never to speak, about an encounter that officially never happened. The classified after-action report buried in some Pentagon filing cabinet lists our training exercise as completed without incident. 2 Army Reserve personnel completed advanced land navigation and survival drills in Chattahoochee National Forest, Georgia. Event logged per training protocol. No further action required. But I remember the eyes, 8 feet off the ground, reflecting moonlight like polished glass, studying us with an intelligence that made every hair on my body stand at attention. I remember footprints in the morning earth that were 18 inches long and 5 toes wide. I remember the smell, musky, organic, alien, that lingered in our campsite long after the creature had melted back into shadows that seemed too deep for the available light. Most of all, I remember the commanding officer who told us that unusual reports from training exercises served no useful military purpose and could damage a soldier's career prospects. The message was delivered with the kind of quiet authority that transforms memories into classified secrets, experiences into things that never happened. 40 years of silence. 40 years of carrying a story that sounds like fiction but felt more real than anything before or since. 40 years of wondering if I was the only one who remembered that night when the impossible revealed itself to 2 young men who were just trying to prove they belonged in the ranks of the Rangers. Then, 3 weeks ago, I received a phone call that changed everything. A voice I hadn't heard in decades, rougher now but unmistakably familiar. My former partner, reaching across 40 years of enforced silence with news that made my blood run cold. It's happening again. The disappearances, the strange reports, the carefully worded official explanations that say nothing while implying everything. And this time, people are asking questions that military protocol can't answer. This is the story they never wanted told. The story of 2 encounters, separated by 14 years, but connected by something far older and more complex than human understanding. The story of first contact with an intelligence that has been sharing our world while remaining invisible, protecting secrets that might be too dangerous for humanity to acknowledge. I'm writing this because silence has become complicity, and because some truths are too important to die with the men who witnessed them. I'm writing this because somewhere in the mountains of North Georgia, ancient minds are still making decisions about humanity's future, and we don't even know the conversation is happening. My name doesn't matter, my rank doesn't matter. What matters is what we saw, what we learned, and what it means for everyone who walks in wild places where old rules still apply and older intelligences still watch from shadows deeper than any map can measure. The morning mist clung to the ridgelines of the Chattahoochee National Forest like smoke from a dying campfire. I pressed my back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, feeling the weight of my rucksack settle into the familiar ache between my shoulder blades. The radio crackled once, then fell silent. We were officially on our own. 48 hours, that's what they'd given us. 48 hours to prove we could survive in these mountains with nothing but basic gear and the skills they'd drilled into us at Camp Merrill. The other soldiers had fanned out across different sectors of the forest, each pair given coordinates that would keep them miles apart. The isolation was intentional. Rangers operated alone behind enemy lines with no backup coming over the hill. This exercise would test whether we'd absorb that lesson or wash out like so many others before us. My partner moved ahead of me with the practiced stealth of someone who'd grown up hunting in terrain like this. His boots found purchase on rocks and fallen logs, while mine seemed to find every twig and loose stone in Georgia. The man was a ghost in olive drab, and I found myself both grateful for his competence and slightly intimidated by it. We'd been paired randomly, 2 reservists thrown together for this final phase of ranger training, but it was clear one of us belonged here more than the other. The October air carried the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Somewhere in the canopy above, a woodpecker hammered against dead wood in an irregular rhythm that seemed to echo off the mountainsides. The Appalachians stretched endlessly in every direction, ridge after ridge of green peaks fading into blue distance. It was beautiful country, but there was something primal about it too, something that reminded you how small and vulnerable humans really were when stripped of their cities and technology. We'd been walking for 3 hours when we found our first checkpoint, a small metal canister hung from a wire stretched between 2 trees, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside was a slip of paper with new coordinates and a cryptic message about adapting to changing mission parameters. Standard stuff, but it meant our route would take us deeper into the wilderness than originally planned. The terrain grew rougher as we climbed. What had started as well-maintained hiking trails gave way to game paths, then to nothing but compass bearings and topographical intuition. My partner consulted the map frequently, correlating landmarks with the squiggly lines that represented elevation changes. The forest closed around us like a living thing, branches interlocking overhead to create a green tunnel that filtered the sunlight into scattered coins of gold. By late afternoon, we'd covered nearly 15 miles of rugged ground. My legs burned and my lungs worked harder in the thin mountain air. But there was satisfaction in the exhaustion. This was what we'd trained for, what separated rangers from regular infantry. The ability to keep moving when your body wanted to quit, to think clearly when fatigue clouded your judgment, to remain effective when comfort was a distant memory. We made camp in a small clearing beside a creek that tumbled down from somewhere high above. The water was clear and cold, tasting of granite and moss. While my partner set up our shelter, a simple lean-to constructed from fallen branches and our poncho, I gathered firewood and scouted the perimeter. The forest felt different here, older somehow. The trees were massive, their trunks disappearing into shadows that seemed too deep for the available light. That first night passed without incident. We ate cold MREs and drank creek water treated with iodine tablets. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, and we huddled close to our small fire, feeding it carefully to avoid creating too much light or smoke. Rangers learned to be invisible, even in training exercises. The instructors could appear anywhere, testing our fieldcraft and tactical awareness. I took the first watch while my partner slept. The forest at night was a different world entirely. Sounds that were comforting during the day became ominous in the darkness. Every rustle of leaves could be an instructor trying to catch us off guard, every crack of a branch a potential threat assessment. But gradually, I learned to distinguish between the normal sounds of a living forest and anything that might represent danger. An owl called from somewhere across the creek, its hollow voice echoing off the mountainside. Something large crashed through the underbrush in the distance, probably a deer spooked by our presence. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks spiraling up toward the stars visible through gaps in the canopy. It was peaceful in its way, peaceful and utterly isolated. The second day brought new challenges. Our order were to reach a specific ridgeline by nightfall, but the terrain between us and that objective was some of the roughest in the national forest. We climbed through dense laurel thickets that grabbed at our equipment and forced us to crawl on hands and knees. We navigated around cliff faces that dropped away into misty valleys hundreds of feet below. We forded streams swollen with recent rain, the current strong enough to knock a careless man off his feet. My respect for my partner continued to grow. He seemed to read the landscape like a book, finding routes through impossible terrain, water sources when our canteens ran low, shelter when sudden squalls swept across the ridges. More importantly, he never made me feel inadequate for my own struggles with the environment. When I slipped on wet rocks or lost the trail in thick vegetation, he simply waited patiently for me to recover and find my way. By afternoon, we were behind schedule. The ridgeline that had looked achievable on the map was proving more elusive in reality. Every time we thought we'd reached our objective, another valley opened up before us, requiring a detour that added hours to our movement. The sun was already slanting low through the trees when we finally gained the elevation we needed. The view from the ridge was spectacular. The Chattahoochee National Forest spread out below us like a green ocean, ridge after ridge rolling away toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, other pairs of soldiers were fighting their own battles with terrain and fatigue. But up here, we felt like the only humans for 100 miles in any direction. We found a defensible position among some large boulders and began preparing for our second night in the field. This time, we were more confident in our routine. water from a small spring that bubbled up between the rocks, a sheltered spot for our lean-to that would be invisible from below, a fire position that could be quickly extinguished if necessary. But something felt different about this place. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been present at our previous campsite. The forest seemed unusually quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had died to an unnatural stillness. My partner felt it too. I could see it in the way he kept scanning the tree line, the way his hand drifted unconsciously toward his knife. We ate our evening meal in relative silence, both of us listening for sounds that didn't come. The absence of normal forest noise was more unsettling than any threat we might have identified. It was as if the entire mountain had decided to hold its breath. The sun disappeared behind the western ridges, and darkness fell quickly in the deep valleys below us. We built our fire smaller than usual, just enough for warmth and to boil water for coffee. The flames cast dancing shadows among the boulders, creating a small circle of light in an ocean of blackness. I was cleaning my rifle when the first sound reached us. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing. A rumbling that seemed to come from deep in the valley, echoing off the mountainsides until it was impossible to pinpoint its source. At first, I thought it might be thunder from a distant storm, but the sky above was clear and full of stars. The sound repeated, longer this time, with a different quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. My partner had stopped what he was doing and was staring into the darkness beyond our fire. His body language had changed completely, shifting from relaxed alertness to something approaching genuine alarm. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't anything either of us had encountered before. The call came again, closer now. It had an almost musical quality, like the lowest notes of a pipe organ, but with an organic warmth that no instrument could produce. It rose and fell in complex patterns, seeming to communicate something beyond our understanding. Other sounds answered from different directions, creating a chorus that surrounded our position on the ridge. We extinguished the fire immediately, plunging our small camp into complete darkness. Without the flames, the forest seemed to press closer, the shadows taking on substance and weight. We sat back to back, weapons ready, trying to pierce the blackness with eyes that had grown accustomed to firelight. The calls continued for perhaps 20 minutes, moving around us in a pattern that suggested intelligence and coordination. Whatever was out there was communicating, possibly about us. The sounds would fade into the distance, then return from a completely different direction. Sometimes they seemed to come from the valley below, sometimes from ridges we knew were miles away. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the calls stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the sounds had been. Not the normal quiet of a sleeping forest, but the absolute stillness that comes when every living thing is hiding. We waited in that silence for what felt like hours, muscles cramped from maintaining ready positions, ears straining for any indication of what we were dealing with. It was nearly midnight when we heard the first tree fall. The crash echoed across the valley like a gunshot, followed by the prolonged groaning of wood under impossible stress. Then another tree fell, and another. Something was moving through the forest below us with enough force to snap mature hardwoods like matchsticks. The sounds were getting closer. My partner touched my shoulder and pointed toward a gap in the rocks, where we could observe the valley without exposing ourselves. We low-crawled to the position, keeping our bodies pressed against the cold stone. Below us, perhaps half a mile away, we could see the forest canopy swaying in ways that had nothing to do with wind. A large tree, easily 3 feet in diameter, suddenly bent sideways and toppled with a crash that sent birds exploding from the surrounding woods. The disturbance was moving up the valley in our general direction, leaving a path of destruction that was clearly visible even in the dim starlight. Whatever was down there was massive. The trees it was destroying weren't saplings or dead falls, but mature oak and hickory that would require heavy machinery to move under normal circumstances. Yet something was plowing through them as if they were tall grass. We watched the destruction advance up the valley for another 10 minutes. The path was roughly straight, suggesting purpose rather than random movement. Something was traveling through the forest with a specific destination in mind, and it didn't care what obstacles lay in its path. Then the sound stopped again. The sudden silence was jarring after the continuous noise of falling timber. We kept watching the forest canopy, but nothing moved. Whatever had been down there had either stopped or changed direction. We maintained our observation post for another hour, but the woods remained still. Eventually, we decided one of us should try to get some sleep while the other maintained watch. The normal 4-hour rotation seemed inadequate given what we'd experienced, so we agreed on 2-hour shifts. My partner took the first watch while I tried to rest among the boulders. Sleep came fitfully. Every time I began to drift off, some sound would jerk me back to consciousness. My partner shook me awake at 0200 hours. His face was pale in the starlight, and his hands trembled slightly as he handed me the watch. He'd seen something during his shift, something that had shaken his usual composure. But he said nothing, just rolled into his sleeping bag and closed his eyes tightly. The next 2 hours passed slowly. I scanned the forest below, watching for any sign of movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The moon had risen, casting everything in silver and deep shadow. The destruction from earlier was clearly visible now, a swath of broken trees cutting across the valley like a scar. At 0400, I heard footsteps. They were coming from the forest below our position, moving slowly and deliberately up the slope. But these weren't human footsteps. Each one landed with enough force to shake the ground, and the spacing between them suggested a stride length impossible for any person. Whatever was climbing toward us was taking its time, placing each step carefully, perhaps testing our position. I woke my partner with a gentle touch to his shoulder. He came instantly alert, the mark of good training and natural instinct. I pointed down the slope and held up my hand to indicate we should listen. The footsteps continued, closer now, accompanied by the sound of small trees being pushed aside. We had perhaps 5 minutes before whatever was climbing the slope reached our position among the boulders. The smart, tactical move would have been to withdraw immediately, to put distance between ourselves and an unknown threat. But this was a training exercise in a national forest. The worst we should encounter was an instructor trying to test our reactions, or perhaps a curious bear. That's what we told ourselves anyway. The footsteps reached the edge of our boulder field and stopped. In the sudden silence, we could hear breathing. Deep, slow inhalations and exhalations that suggested lungs far larger than those of any human. The sound was coming from perhaps 30 feet away, just beyond the largest of the rock formations that sheltered our camp. Then we smelled it. The odor was unlike anything I'd encountered before or since. It was organic, definitely animal, but with a complexity that suggested intelligence and awareness. Not the simple musk of a bear or deer, but something layered and nuanced, like the scent of a large predator mixed with herbs and earth, and something else I couldn't identify. A rock scraped against stone somewhere very close to our position. Whatever was out there was moving again, but quietly now, with the stealth of something that understood it was being observed. We pressed ourselves deeper into our concealed position, hardly daring to breathe. That's when I saw it. The creature moved between 2 large boulders, perhaps 20 feet from where we lay hidden. In the moonlight, it appeared as a massive silhouette, easily 8 feet tall and proportionally broad across the shoulders. It moved upright on 2 legs, but with a fluidity and power that was completely inhuman. Its arms were long and heavily muscled, hanging nearly to its knees. Its head was large and seemed to sit directly on its shoulders without much of a neck. The creature paused in the gap between the boulders, and I had the distinct impression it was studying our campsite. Its head turned slowly from side to side, and I caught a glimpse of eyes that reflected the moonlight like mirrors. It knew we were there. I was certain of it. But it made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of hostility. For perhaps 30 seconds, we observed each other in silence. The creature remained perfectly still, a statue carved from shadow and starlight. Beside me, my partner was holding his breath, his body rigid with tension. The only sounds were our own heartbeats and the creature's slow, deep breathing. Then, with movements that were surprisingly graceful for something so large, the creature stepped back into the shadows between the rocks. We heard its footsteps moving away, still careful and deliberate, but gradually fading into the distance. Within a few minutes, the only sounds were the normal nighttime chorus of the forest. We remained in our concealed position until first light, neither of us speaking, both trying to process what we'd witnessed. When dawn finally broke over the eastern ridges, we found ourselves looking at a campsite that showed clear evidence of visitation. Large footprints in the soft earth around our fire pit, each one easily 18 inches long and showing the impression of 5 toes. Broken branches at a height of 8 feet where something had passed between the trees, a lingering odor that the morning breeze couldn't quite dispel. We broke camp quickly and efficiently, neither of us eager to spend more time in that place. Our final checkpoint was only a few miles away, and we covered the distance in record time despite our fatigue and the difficult terrain. The familiar sounds of military activity, helicopters, radio chatter, diesel engines, were more welcome than they'd ever been before. The debriefing was routine, questions about navigation, survival techniques, physical conditioning, mental resilience. We gave the expected answers, focusing on the tactical and technical aspects of our exercise. When asked if we'd encountered anything unusual, we exchanged a brief glance before responding in the negative. But our commanding officer wasn't finished with us. After the other soldiers had been dismissed, he asked us to remain behind. When we were alone in his tent, he studied us for a long moment before speaking. He told us that unusual reports sometimes came out of training exercises in this part of the national forest. Reports that couldn't be explained by conventional means and served no useful military purpose. Such reports, he explained, were not helpful to anyone's career and could result in questions about a soldier's psychological fitness for duty. He suggested that we focus our memories on the valuable training we'd received and the skills we'd developed during our time in the field. The forest was full of shadows and strange sounds that could play tricks on tired minds. What mattered was that we'd successfully completed our mission and proven ourselves capable rangers. We were ordered not to discuss our experience with other soldiers, not to file any written reports beyond the standard after-action summaries, and to consider the matter closed. Any future references to unusual encounters during training exercises would be viewed as detrimental to unit cohesion and military discipline. The message was clear. We'd seen what we'd seen, but officially we'd seen nothing at all. I completed ranger training 2 weeks later and returned to my reserve unit. My partner was assigned to a different post, and I never saw him again. Over the years, I've wondered if he thinks about that night on the ridge, if the memory haunts him the way it haunts me. Because I do think about it. Often, I think about the intelligence in those reflected eyes, the careful way the creature moved, the sense of being studied by something that understood far more than it revealed. I think about the calls that seemed to carry complex meaning, the coordinated movement through the forest, the deliberate approach to our position. Most of all, I think about the fact that it could have harmed us easily but chose not to. Whatever we encountered that night in the Chattahoochee National Forest was not just a large animal. It was something that made conscious decisions, something that possessed a form of intelligence we didn't understand. The official records show that our training exercise was completed successfully with no incidents of note. 2 reserve soldiers demonstrated satisfactory performance in wilderness survival and navigation. Standard stuff, filed away and forgotten. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is moving through trees outside my window, I hear echoes of those calls from the Georgia mountains. And I remember what it felt like to be observed by something ancient and powerful, something that belonged to the forest in ways humans never could. The Army trained us to be invisible, to move through enemy territory without being detected. But that night, we learned what it truly meant to be watched by something that was better at the game than we were. Something that had been perfecting the art of remaining hidden long before the first human ever set foot in those mountains. I've never returned to the Chattahoochee National Forest. I tell myself it's because I'm older now, less interested in hiking and camping. But the truth is simpler than that. Some places change you, and once changed, you can never go back to what you were before. That ridge line in North Georgia changed me. It taught me that the world is larger and stranger than any training manual suggests, full of mysteries that official reports can't capture and experiences that don't fit neatly into military categories. I served my country for 22 years after that night, retiring as a senior non-commissioned officer with commendations for leadership and technical expertise. I've trained soldiers, led missions, and faced dangers in several different theaters of operation. But nothing I experienced in all those years of military service compares to those few minutes on a Georgia mountain ridge when something vast and unknowable chose to reveal itself to two young soldiers who were just trying to prove they belonged in the ranks of the Rangers. The encounter lasted perhaps 5 minutes from start to finish, 5 minutes out of a 48-hour training exercise, out of a 30-year military career, out of a lifetime of accumulated experiences. But those 5 minutes contain more wonder and terror and pure mystery than all the rest combined. I keep the secret because I was ordered to, because speaking of it would serve no useful purpose, because the official world has no place for such stories. But I also keep it because some experiences are too profound to share casually, too important to risk having them diminished by skepticism or misunderstanding. The creature we encountered that night was real. I know this with the same certainty I know my own name. It was intelligent, aware, and capable of making complex decisions about how to interact with the strange bipedal visitors who had wandered into its territory. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the deep woods of the Appalachians, following game trails known only to itself. Sometimes I imagine it remembers that night on the ridge as clearly as I do, filing the encounter away in whatever passes for memory in a mind so different from our own. But mostly, I just remember the eyes, intelligent eyes that studied us with the same curiosity we felt toward them. Eyes that belonged to something that had every right to call those mountains home, something that had been there long before Rangers started training in the Chattahoochee National Forest and would be there long after the last soldier had departed. But our story didn't end with that first encounter on the ridge. The creature's visit had marked us in ways we didn't immediately understand, creating a connection to that place that would draw us back years later under circumstances neither of us could have anticipated. It was 1997, 14 years after our initial training exercise, when I received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was older, rougher around the edges, but unmistakably familiar. My former partner had tracked me down through military records, reaching out after more than a decade of silence. He was working as a civilian contractor now, he explained, providing survival training to various government agencies. A new assignment had brought him back to the Chattahoochee National Forest, to the same general area where we'd encountered the impossible all those years ago. He needed someone he could trust, someone who understood what we'd experienced that night on the ridge. 3 park rangers had gone missing over the past 6 months, all experienced woodsmen, all familiar with the terrain, all vanished without a trace in the same remote section of forest where we'd completed our training. Search and rescue teams had found no sign of struggle, no equipment, no bodies, just empty forest and unanswered questions. The official theory was that the men had fallen victim to accidents, but rangers reporting strange calls echoing through the valleys, evidence of large trees being moved or broken in ways that defied explanation, a pervasive sense of being watched during search operations. He wanted me to join him for an unofficial reconnaissance, a chance to revisit the area and see if we could find any connection between the missing men and what we'd encountered years before. It wasn't a military operation, he stressed. Just 2 former soldiers trying to understand whether their shared experience might shed light on a current mystery. I should have said no. My active duty days were behind me. I had a family and civilian responsibilities, and there was no logical reason to believe our encounter could explain the disappearances. But something in his voice, a note of urgency mixed with fear, convinced me to take leave from my job and drive down to Georgia. We met at a ranger station on the edge of the national forest. My partner looked older, grayer, but still possessed the lean efficiency that had impressed me during our training. He'd brought detailed topographical maps, photographs of the missing men, and copies of the search reports that had been shared with his training team. The 3 rangers had disappeared in different locations, but all within a roughly triangular area that encompassed the ridge where we'd made our encounter. The 3rd ranger had been the most experienced of the group, a 20-year veteran who knew the Chattahoochee better than anyone. He'd been investigating reports of illegal camping in a restricted watershed area. His last radio contact placed him less than 2 miles from our old training site. That was 3 weeks ago. We studied the reports and maps throughout the afternoon, looking for patterns that might not be obvious to searchers unfamiliar with our experience. The distribution of the disappearances did seem to follow game trails and water sources in the deep forest, areas where large animals might travel regularly. More significantly, all 3 men had vanished during periods when other hikers and campers reported hearing unusual sounds in the forest. As evening approached, we loaded our packs with minimal gear and headed into the woods. We both carried more sophisticated equipment than we'd had during our original training: GPS units, satellite phones, night vision devices, but we traveled light, planning to cover ground quickly rather than establish permanent camps. The forest had changed in the 14 years since our first visit. Some areas showed the effects of logging operations and trail improvements, while others seemed wilder and more overgrown than before. We reached the general area of our original encounter just as darkness was settling over the mountains. The ridge looked different in the autumn light, but the fundamental geography was unchanged. We could see the boulder field where we'd hidden, the valley where we'd watched trees being destroyed, the game trails that wound between ancient hardwoods. We made camp in a different location this time, choosing a spot that offered multiple escape routes and clear sight lines in several directions. Neither of us spoke about our tactical preparations, but we both understood that this wasn't a nostalgic visit to an old training site. We were looking for answers to questions that had haunted us for over a decade. The first 2 nights passed without incident. We found nothing conclusive, a few tracks in soft earth that could have been made by anything, some broken branches at unusual heights, areas where the normal forest sounds seemed muted. But we both felt it again. That sense of being observed, of moving through territory controlled by something that understood our presence better than we understood its. The feeling had been subtle during our original encounter, masked by fatigue and the general stress of training. Now, with years of experience and mature judgment, we recognized it for what it was: the awareness that comes from being studied by a superior intelligence. On the 3rd night, as we sat around a carefully contained fire, my partner finally voiced what we'd both been thinking. The missing rangers hadn't simply disappeared, they'd been taken. Something in these mountains was actively removing human beings who ventured too deep into its territory, doing so with a skill and stealth that left no evidence conventional searchers could interpret. The question was whether we were dealing with the same creature we'd encountered years before, or something else entirely. We were discussing these possibilities when the calls began again. They started low and distant, just as they had during our training exercise. But this time they seemed more urgent, more complex in their patterns and variations. Multiple voices answered from different directions, creating a 3-dimensional chorus that surrounded our position completely. We extinguished our fire and took defensive positions among the trees, but this time we were better prepared. Night vision devices revealed the forest in eerie green detail, showing us movement that would have been invisible to the naked eye. Our GPS units confirmed our exact location, and satellite phones provided a link to the outside world if we needed emergency extraction. The calls continued for nearly an hour, sometimes close enough to shake the ground beneath our feet, sometimes so distant they seemed to come from other mountains entirely. Then the forest fell silent. We waited in our positions, scanning the darkness through our night vision equipment, every sense focused on detecting movement or threat. Minutes passed without sound or motion. Then, at the very edge of our vision, we saw them. 3 figures moving through the trees with the fluid grace of natural predators. They were massive, easily matching the size of the creature we'd encountered during training, but their coordinated movements suggested a level of organization we hadn't witnessed before. They traveled in a loose formation, maintaining spacing that allowed them to cover more ground while remaining in visual contact with each other. They were hunting. The realization struck us both simultaneously. These creatures weren't simply moving through their territory, they were conducting a systematic search, following patterns and protocols that spoke of intelligence and planning. They moved from concealment to concealment, pausing to scan their surroundings before advancing to the next position. And they were heading directly toward our location. We had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached our defensive position. We made a decision that would have seemed insane to our younger selves. We decided to make contact. My partner activated a small LED flashlight, covering most of its beam with his fingers to create a dim red glow. He pointed the light toward the approaching figures and flashed it 3 times, then waited. After a moment, he repeated the signal. The creatures stopped moving. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, from the darkness ahead of us came a response. Not light, but sound. 3 low calls that perfectly mimicked the pattern of the flashlight signals. They had understood our attempt at communication and were responding in kind. What followed was unlike anything in my military experience or civilian life. For the next 2 hours, we engaged in a primitive but unmistakable form of communication with beings whose existence defied every scientific and military category I'd ever learned. They approached slowly, stopping frequently to gauge our reactions. We remained in our positions but made no aggressive moves, keeping our weapons ready but not raised. When they were close enough for clear observation through our night vision equipment, they settled into positions that mirrored our own defensive arrangement. We could see them clearly now. 3 creatures, each slightly different in size and build, but all unmistakably members of the same species we'd encountered years before. Their faces were partially human, partially something else entirely. Their eyes reflected our infrared illumination, watching us with an intelligence that was both alien and strangely familiar. The largest of the 3, clearly the leader, began a series of gestures that seemed designed to convey meaning. It pointed toward the valley below, then back toward us, then made a sweeping motion that encompassed the entire forest. The message seemed clear. This was their territory, and we were guests whose behavior would determine our welcome. My partner responded by pointing to himself, then to me, then making a walking motion with his fingers. He was trying to communicate that we were travelers, passing through rather than establishing permanent presence. The creature watched his gestures carefully, then nodded in what appeared to be understanding. What happened next was the most remarkable part of the entire encounter. The leader reached into what appeared to be a pouch or bag made from woven plant fibers and withdrew 3 objects. Even through our night vision equipment, we could see they were personal items: a wallet, a radio, and what looked like a park ranger's badge. The missing rangers. The creature placed the items on the ground between us, then backed away to its original position. The message was clear. They had taken the rangers, and now they were returning their possessions as some form of communication or offering. My partner and I exchanged glances, understanding that we were witnessing something unprecedented. These creatures hadn't simply killed the missing men in territorial disputes. They had captured them, possibly studied them, and now were using their possessions to communicate with us. But where were the rangers themselves? As if sensing our question, the leader gestured toward the deep forest, making a complex series of motions that suggested movement over long distances. Then it pointed to the items on the ground and made what could only be interpreted as a negative gesture, a shaking of its massive head. The rangers were gone, taken somewhere beyond recovery, but the creatures wanted us to know what had happened, wanted to establish some form of understanding about territorial boundaries and acceptable behavior in their domain. Through gestures, sounds, and an intuitive understanding that transcended language barriers, we learned that the creatures had been aware of human activity in their territory for generations. They had developed strategies for avoiding contact, for remaining hidden while coexisting with the growing human presence in the national forest. But something had changed recently. Human activity had increased, penetrating deeper into areas that had previously been undisturbed. The missing rangers had crossed invisible boundaries, had persisted in areas where their presence was not tolerated. The creatures had responded according to their own laws and customs, removing threats to their continued secrecy. They were simply protecting their territory and their existence using methods that seemed reasonable to their own understanding. That's why they had revealed themselves to us. They remembered our encounter years before, when we had observed them without attacking, had kept their secret without betraying their existence. They were hoping to establish communication with humans who might understand the need for boundaries and discretion. The leader reached into its pouch again and withdrew a small object that it placed near the ranger's belongings. Through our night vision, we could see it was carved from wood, shaped into a form that was both abstract and somehow meaningful. It was clearly handmade, a product of intelligence and artistic capability. Then, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the 3 creatures began to withdraw. They moved with the same coordinated precision they had shown while approaching. fading back into the forest with a skill that made our own military training seem crude by comparison. Before disappearing completely, the leader turned back toward our position and made one final gesture. It pointed to the objects on the ground, then to us, then made a motion toward the outside world. The meaning was unmistakable. Take these things, tell the story, but tell it carefully. We waited until full daylight before approaching the items they had left. The Rangers' possessions were exactly what they appeared to be, personal effects that confirmed the fate of the missing men. But the carved object was something else entirely, a piece of evidence that proved the existence of a culture and intelligence operating just beyond the edges of human awareness. We spent the rest of that day hiking out of the forest, both of us silent as we processed what we had experienced. By the time we reached civilization, we had agreed on a course of action that balanced our obligations to the missing Rangers' families with our understanding of the larger situation. We reported the discovery of the Rangers' belongings to the appropriate authorities, providing GPS coordinates and detailed accounts of where the items had been found. We described evidence of large animal activity in the area, unusual tracks and disturbances that suggested the involvement of creatures unfamiliar to local wildlife experts. But we said nothing about the communication, the organized behavior, or the clear evidence of intelligence we had witnessed. The carved object remained in my possession, hidden away as proof of an encounter that could never be officially acknowledged. Over the years, I've studied it countless times, trying to understand its meaning and significance. It appears to be a map of sorts, showing the topography of the national forest with markers that might indicate territorial boundaries or sites of special importance. The official investigation concluded that the 3 Rangers had fallen victim to a large predator, possibly a bear or mountain lion acting unusually aggressively. The case was closed, the families received compensation, and the area was temporarily restricted to prevent further incidents. But I knew the truth was more complex than any official report could acknowledge. The creatures we had encountered were not mindless predators, but intelligent beings trying to protect their existence in a world increasingly dominated by human activity. The experience changed both of us in ways that extended far beyond our original encounter. My partner left his contracting work and became an advocate for wilderness preservation, dedicating his remaining career to protecting habitats where unknown species might still exist undisturbed. Years have passed since that second encounter, and I've often wondered whether the communication achieved its intended purpose. Have other humans crossed into territory they didn't understand? Have the creatures been forced to take defensive action again? The forest keeps its secrets, and we learn to keep ours. But on quiet nights when the world seems full of ordinary explanations for ordinary things, I remember what it felt like to brush against something extraordinary. The mountains of North Georgia taught us more than any manual ever could about the nature of respect, humility, and the vast unknowns that exist just beyond the edges of our carefully mapped and categorized world. Some lessons can only be learned in darkness, in silence, in moments when the ordinary rules no longer apply. The carved object sits in a drawer in my study, wrapped in cloth and hidden from casual observation. But sometimes I take it out and hold it, feeling the smooth wood worn by hands unlike any humans, shaped by a mind operating according to principles I may never fully understand. It serves as a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than any training manual suggests, full of mysteries that official reports can't capture, and experiences that don't fit neatly into any category we've created for organizing reality. And it reminds me that somewhere in the mountains of North Georgia, ancient intelligences continue their careful existence, protecting secrets that humanity may not be ready to acknowledge, maintaining boundaries that allow 2 very different species to share the same world without destroying each other. For more interesting stories, check this out.